BC, Aristotle, in his History of Animals, sings their praises. Of the Molossian breed of dogs, such as are employed in the chase, are pretty much the same as those elsewhere. But sheepdogs of this breed are superior to the others in size and in the courage with which they face the attacks of wild animals. Dogs that are born of a mixed breed between these two kinds are remarkable for courage and endurance of hard labour. These were big, brutish dogs, often with white fur so the shepherd could see the dog in poor light and distinguish it from other animals at a distance. Roman livestock guardian dogs wore spectacular spiked metal collars, something that wouldn't look out of place on Dennis the Menace's dog Gnasher from the Beano. Far from being for show, these collars gave guardian dogs a fighting chance in a head-to-head battle. Wolves and other wild predators often going for the neck in an attack. Not everyone needed such a big, muscly dog, however. Most people at this time would have owned only a few sheep and practiced mixed farming on a modest scale. And large dogs such as Molosses would have had hearty appetites, which would have put them beyond the means of most families. Livestock guardian dogs were only needed if two conditions were met. One was the practice of large-scale transhuman or nomadic sheep farming, and the other was the presence of a genuine threat from carnivorous predators such as bears, wolves, lions, leopards and cheetahs, depending on where you lived. In the few parts of the world where large carnivores still prey on sheep, herders often rely on livestock guardians. In Mongolia, for example, Bankar dogs are used to protect flocks and other herds from the last few remaining snow leopards and wolves that roam the wilderness. In England, by contrast, thanks to our consistent and ruthless persecution of large predators, the lynx had gone by the end of Roman rule, brown bears had disappeared before the Norman conquest, and wolves had all but vanished by 1500. Indeed, in 1570, the physician John Keys, one of the founders of Gonville and Caius College, Cambridge, wrote, "Our shepherd's dog is not huge, vast and big, but of an indifferent stature and growth, because it has not to deal with the bloodthirsty wolf, since there be none in England." While the job description of the livestock guardian could be summed up as a shepherd's killer companion, the herding dog required an entirely different skill set. Rather than defend, the herding dog's aim was to drive sheep in a particular direction, either by barking, body language, nips or touches of the muzzle. And unlike livestock guardians, the history of the herding dog is a bit of a mystery. What's interesting is that although the livestock guardian dog is the more aggressive of the two types of dog, it is the sheep dog who's encouraged to behave more like his wolf cousin. Livestock guardians have had their instinct to devour the sheep bred out of them, but the skill of the shepherd is to get a herding dog to mimic his natural instinct to hunt and to separate out or gather together the sheep. It's also curious that the development of the herding dog may have come much later than the livestock guardian. While there are mentions of sheepdogs in Columella's 1st century AD work De Re Rustica, they are not in a form we would recognise. These kinds of dogs were used to chase after wolves or pursue predators that had taken a sheep, and so were bred to be long, slim, fast and strong. But there's no hint of the trained, biddable sheepdog we know today. Columella does, however, suggest the idea of using short names for dogs to make sure they responded quickly to their owner's commands. His favourites included Ferox, fierce, Keller, speedy, Lupa, wolf, and Tigris, tiger. It's no coincidence that one of the world's oldest dog names, Fido, roughly translates from ancient Latin to faithful or trusty. While no one knows who invented the first sheepdog, there are plenty of candidates for early breeds, each emerging independently around the world. The Tibetan Terrier and Hungarian Puli, for example, both probably share an ancient rootstock with the small herding dog first developed by the Kuman people of Western China sometime before the 9th century AD. The Vikings also had their own version of sheepdogs. The Norwegian Buhund is one of the oldest Nordic breeds, the name roughly translating to homestead dog. Its early origins are lost in time, but by the end of the 9th century, the Vikings had introduced their sheep-herding Buhunds to Iceland, Shetland and Greenland, where descendants of those dogs still exist. A genetic study also found that the German Shepherd, the French Berger Picard, and 5 different Italian herding breeds, including the Cane da Pastore di Europa and Cane Toccatore, also share a common lineage. It's difficult to know what these early sheepdogs actually did. The word toccatore, which comes from the Italian toccare, to touch, gives us a clue, as does another name for the same type of breed, paratore dogs. Paratore in Vulgar Latin means to push forward, but early medieval writing on sheepdogs suggests that the relationship wasn't perhaps as involved and mutual as we see in later breeds. In 1379, the Frenchman Jean de Brie, in Le Bon Berger, The Good Shepherd, one of the earliest how-to books, suggests that a shepherd's dog should be trained to grab sheep only by the ear, and that it would learn to follow its master by having its jaw and front feet rubbed with bacon rind. By the 1700s, however, the value of a well-trained dog was apparent, reflected in practical farming guides of the time. The 18th century English farmer and agricultural writer William Ellis was struck by one particularly obedient, intelligent sheepdog. This dog was so well broke that he would go before a flock, round it, side it, or keep behind it, and this nearer or farther off at the word of command. Ellis even adds sweetly, "This shepherd set his love so much on his dog that if anyone struck it hard, he has been seen to cry." Perhaps the most iconic of all sheepdogs, however, is the Border Collie. When the Romans came to England in the 1st century AD, they brought their large, heavy-boned dogs with them. Relatives of these tough, hard-working herding dogs may have bred with Spitz-type dogs brought by the Vikings centuries later to produce an agile, rugged dog perfectly equipped to work the rocky hills of the Scottish and Welsh borders, hence the name. The collie bit is harder to work out. One thought is that it refers to their coal-black colouring. A collie is both a rural name for a sheep with a black face and legs, and a dialect word for blackbird. As soon as people began to congregate in towns, a problem reared its head. If you can't live near your food source, the food source has to be brought to you. And so began the role of the drover, the person whose job it was to drive livestock belonging to farmers and landholders huge distances to urban markets. From the 11th century to the coming of the railways in the first half of the 19th century, people travelling across Britain were often greeted by the sight of hundreds of sheep, cattle, pigs and geese pouring like water from upland hill country into lowland market towns. The men who drove these animals were the cowboys of their time, tough, well-paid workers who were often trusted with more than just the welfare of their flock. As regular travellers from country to city, drovers were often asked to carry news, parcels or letters, take on financial commissions, and even chaperone the offspring of wealthy families. Life on the open road wasn't for everyone, however, and many people viewed the itinerant life of the drover with suspicion. Drovers were often accused of deception, theft, and loose morals. William Harrison, writing in 1577, complains, "So many of them are too lewd." Sometimes it was difficult to tell between drovers and the wandering poor, or vagabonds, a problem that particularly worried the Elizabethans. During this time, in an attempt to clear up the confusion and weed out any unscrupulous drovers, statutes were passed that limited the profession to those who were married and above the age of 30, not including hired servants. If the drover met these conditions, he could then apply for a licence at cost and was required to pay another fee for the privilege of registering with the clerk of the peace, who kept a list of all the names and addresses of legitimate drovers, although contemporary accounts of drovers' drunken, wenching ways once they got into town suggests they weren't always on their best behaviour. Among the oldest thoroughfares still in existence, drovers' roads shaped the landscape of Britain and many other parts of Europe. Some routes that became drovers' roads had a more ancient history, often dating back to prehistoric times, and many of them continued to be used long after the clatter of hooves had ceased. In Britain, most of the droving roads led from the wild, hilly areas of Scotland, Wales and the West Country towards the growing market towns and cities in the east and south, including London. Animals were often marched vast distances and in large numbers. Daniel Defoe, writing in the 1720s, describes livestock being driven the long stretch between Caithness in Scotland to East Anglia, a one-way trek of around 600 miles, 965 kilometres. In North Yorkshire, the Hambleton Drove Road still exists, part of an ancient route that took beasts from Scotland to market in England. At its height, during the early 19th century, up to 100,000 animals were herded south along it every year. Across the country, the drove roads were alive with the constant movement of livestock on the hoof. During the 18th century, London's Smithfield Market took in 750,000 sheep and 100,000 cattle from drovers each year. It's difficult to imagine just what a spectacle the droving party would have made. Over the noise and clamour of hundreds of animals, drovers walking or riding alongside their charges would shout cries of "Hep-tree-ho! Hep-tree-ho!" to warn locals of their approach and give farmers time to pen up their own animals lest they got swept along in the drive. Dogs trotted alongside, nipping at stragglers and keeping the flocks tightly controlled. A number of breeds were well suited to the task, including the Queen's favourite, the heel-snapping corgi, and the gentle giant, the Old English sheepdog. The last of these two sheepdogs used to be called the bobtail collie. In the 18th century, working dogs were exempt from taxation, while pet dogs were taxed. To tell the difference, working dogs, including droving dogs, would have their tails docked or bobbed. The relationship between drover and dog was a close one, however. Mary Russell Mitford, sketching rural life in the 1820s, described life for both master and mutt. No man between Salisbury Plain and Smithfield was thought to conduct a flock so skilfully through all the difficulties of lanes and commons, streets and high roads, as Jack Bint, aided by Jack Bint's famous dog, Watch. For Watch's rough, honest face, black with a little white about the muzzle and one white ear, was as well known at fairs and markets as his master's equally honest and weather-beaten visage, Watch being renowned for keeping a flock together better than any shepherd's dog on the road, Jack for delivering them more punctually and in better condition. No man had a more thorough knowledge of the proper night stations where good feed might be procured for his charge and good liquor for Watch and himself. Watch, like other sheepdogs, being accustomed to live chiefly on bread and beer. It also wasn't unheard of for drovers' dogs to make their own way home. An account from the 1920s remembers a Welsh drover named Clough and his faithful companion. A dog named Carlo with a wonderful ability for cattle driving. Once when the drover was in Kent, after long persuasion he sold his pony to a customer and decided to go home by coach. The pony's saddle was put on Carlo's back, with a note attached asking the landlords of the inns where he used to stay to give Carlo food and a resting place and then send him on. Carlo was told to go home, and home he went, calling at every inn where he used to stay with his master. After about a week's journey, he reached Llandrillo safely with the saddle on his back. Not all drovers made it back home. The churchyard in Southam, Warwickshire, for example, has several graves of Welsh drovers who died en route to London, including a Robert Lloyd of Diallt, who died in 1773 from drinking small beer when hot at the local tavern. But droving wasn't all about the sheep. Drovers were often entrusted with large sums of money, not only cash from the sale of the animals at market, but also rents collected on behalf of landlords and business debts. Travelling with pockets stuffed with money was a dangerous gamble and made drovers easy targets for thieves and cutthroats, and so an early system of private banks was established along popular routes, especially in Wales. The small scale and idiosyncrasy of these country banks, and others connected with different trades, was reflected in the banknotes they issued. Printed in copperplate script on large, thin sheets of paper, with details such as the date of issue and partner's signature often added by hand, these characterful notes often advertised and celebrated the industry they represented. Sailing ships for banks in coastal areas, ploughs, cattle or sheep for farming areas, tin mining in Cornwall, cider making in Herefordshire, and sheep shearing in Whitby. The Drovers' Bank, the Aberystwyth and Tregaron, had black sheep on its notes, the number of sheep denoting the number of pounds, leading to locals calling it the Bank of Thava Ddu, or Bank of the Black Sheep. Drovers also acted as chaperones or guardians. Journeying alone was a perilous business, so some people took the opportunity to travel to town under the protection of the drover. Sons of wealthy merchants and landowners would tag alongside a droving party, partly for protection and partly for the adventure. It wasn't usually seen as a suitable journey for a woman, but we know of at least one, Jane Evans from Tynawan, Carmarthenshire, who in the mid-19th century travelled with drovers all the way from rural Wales to London in order to join up with nurses heading for Balaclava and the Crimean War. While dogs and drovers worked hard to keep a flock together, bellwether sheep would often help keep their own kind in step. Bellwethers were and are male sheep trained to lead the flock. The name comes from wether, the Middle English word for a castrated ram, and bell, the sheep would wear a bell around its neck so it could be heard even when out of sight. Treated differently from the rest of the flock, bellwethers were raised and fed by hand and would tamely follow the shepherd or drover, leading the rest of the sheep in whatever direction was needed. Abattoirs in the early 20th century often employed bellwethers to lead flocks of sheep calmly to their slaughter. These unwitting accomplices to the meat trade became known as Judas sheep. A 1921 copy of the Seattle Daily Times notes, "One of the very necessary features of every packing house is the Judas, an animal trained to walk up the chutes leading to the killing room and lead others of his kind to their doom. There have been Judas steer, Judas sheep, and Judas hogs which lived by betraying their kind." Bellwethering was, however, an ancient practice. Aristotle, for example, writes of every flock having a bellwether and it answering to its own name. It continued throughout the medieval period. Few accounts exist from this time, but one rare example comes from the drover to King Edward II, who describes a ragtag band of men and boys making slow progress leading sheep and other animals from Lincolnshire to Yorkshire to stock up land belonging to the Crown. John the Barber, the valet in question, took 313 ewes, to which he assigned a master shepherd at twopence and 2 boys at threepence a day, and 272 lambs and 1 bellwether, to which again he assigned 2 boys at the same wage. On Friday, May the 13th, this miscellaneous herd set out on a progress of nearly 130 miles to Tadcaster in South Yorkshire, where it was to be broken up for the stocking of various royal manors. It covered the first 12 miles, from Sutton to Spalding, in 2 days, the second 12 miles, from Spalding to Curtin in Holland, in 1 day, and the 15 miles from Curtin to Bolingbroke in 2 days, on the first of which John the Barber hired 12 crossboys to chase the said animals through the town of Boston. The word bellwether is still in common use, but not with its original meaning. Now a term thrown around the floors of stock exchanges, it's used to mean a share or company that indicates the future performance of the economy, a harbinger of financial markets. A bellwether can also mean a trendsetter. Only in the English language could it be a compliment to be compared to a castrated ram. Drovers' roads haven't just shaped the landscape of Britain. Spain has the largest network of drove roads anywhere in Europe, some 78,000 miles, 125,000 kilometres, of what are called vías pecuarias. Some have been in use since Neolithic times, when hunter-gatherers followed the migratory routes of wild deer, sheep and ox as they travelled from their winter valley grazing to the cooler summer pastures in the mountains. Unlike Britain, where drove roads were used to take sheep to market, the drove roads of Spain were, and still are, transhumant tracks for moving sheep between areas of seasonal grazing. The numbers of animals involved were at one time staggering. Between the 11th and 17th centuries, around 5 million sheep, mostly merino sheep bred for wool, were moved every year along the vías pecuarias. By the 13th century, the Spanish kingdoms had recognised the economic importance of the drove roads and brought them under royal legal protection. The freedom of movement which these drove roads allow is still integral to livestock breeding in Spain. In recent years, laws have been passed to protect the via pecuarias and the rights of the drovers, even when they clash with the demands of modern city living. Every year in Madrid, for example, large flocks of sheep are still walked through the city streets, not only as a reminder of historic traditions, but because the drove roads always went that way. Madrid started life as a market town along the route of migrating livestock. In fact, many cities and towns, both in Spain and other parts of Europe, including Britain, sprang up along these ancient sheep roads, providing food, drink, shelter and markets for drovers and their flocks. In Australia, the vast network of drovers' roads is nicknamed the Long Paddock and covers much of the nation's vast unpopulated interior. These 200-year-old stock routes, as they're known across Australia, were initially set up before the advent of the railway to allow vast numbers of livestock to move across the country, hugging watering holes, river systems and existing Aboriginal trails. By the early 20th century, the government had started to install purpose-built watering points, each designed to be no more than a day's droving from each other. Queensland has one of the last fully functioning historic droving roads, which stretches along an almost unimaginable 44,740 miles, 72,000 kilometres of track, and covers a region of roughly 2.6 million hectares, 26,000 square kilometres. Drovers still pay a peppercorn fee to use the route, 2 cents per kilometre, but must agree to travel at least 9.5 kilometres a day with their livestock. This not only encourages the drovers and their horses to keep a reasonable pace, but also stops the animals from overgrazing as they make their way to market. Perhaps the most famous destination when it comes to sheep was London's Smithfield. It was the final stopping point for many of the drovers and their flocks, a place that for more than 1,000 years has been a busy hub of livestock trading. Smithfield wasn't unused to baying crowds. As well as being a hectic livestock market, in its long life it has also been a popular venue for jousting, summer fairs and public executions. Famous radicals and criminals who breathed their last breath at the sight of the sheep market include the Scottish national hero William Wallace, subject of the film Braveheart, who was hanged, drawn and quartered here in 1305, and Richard Rouse, the Bishop of Rochester's cook, who was publicly boiled alive in 1531 for poisoning several members of the bishop's household. In 1174, a clerk of Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, described Smithfield as a smooth field where every Friday there is a celebrated rendezvous of fine horses to be traded, and in another quarter are placed vendibles of the peasant, swine with their deep flanks, and cows and oxen of immense bulk. By the mid-1800s, however, chaos reigned, and over 1.5 million sheep came, often stampeding to join the market every year. The Farmer's Magazine from 1848 describes the scene in grim detail. In the course of a year, 220,000 head of cattle and 1,500,000 sheep are violently forced into an area of 5 acres in the very heart of London, through its narrowest and most crowded thoroughfares, and are there sold, and there slaughtered in the dark and undrained cellars, stables and outhouses adjoining. The inhabitants and shopkeepers on the line of march taken by these herds and flocks are weekly righted from their propriety by the transit of 4,000 oxen and 30,000 sheep that are hurried along by reckless drovers and maddened by savage dogs. These claims might sound overblown if it wasn't for dozens of other reports, each painting a picture of a grisly, dung-smeared and overcrowded aggregation of edible quadrupeds. Charles Dickens in Oliver Twist trumps them all, however, with his nightmarish vision. It was market morning. The ground was covered nearly ankle-deep with filth and mire, and a thick steam perpetually rising from the reeking bodies of the cattle and mingling with the fog which seemed to rest upon the chimney-tops hung heavily above. Countrymen, butchers, drovers, hawkers, boys, thieves, idlers and vagabonds of every low grade were mingled together in a dense mass. The whistling of drovers, the barking of dogs, the bellowing and plunging of beasts, the bleating of sheep, and the grunting and squealing of pigs, the cries of hawkers, the shouts, oaths, and quarrelling on all sides, the ringing of bells and the roar of voices that issued from every public house, the crowding, pushing, driving, beating, whooping and yelling, the hideous and discordant din that resounded from every corner of the market, and the unwashed, unshaven, squalid and dirty figures constantly running to and fro and bursting in and out of the throng, rendered it a stunning and bewildering scene which quite confused the senses. Something had to be done. An Act of Parliament forced the livestock market to be moved to new open ground in Islington in the 1850s, while London worked out what to do with the old site. Sir Horace Jones, architect to the City of London, was tasked with designing a building that would deal only in wholesale meat rather than live animals. He outdid himself. Work on the Central Market, now a Grade II listed Italianate gem, was finally completed in 1868 and triumphantly declared a cathedral of meat. Jones went on to design Billingsgate Fish Market, Leadenhall Market, and most famously, Tower Bridge. The future for Smithfield, however, hangs in the balance. Plans are afoot to move Smithfield to the fringes of the capital to join up with Billingsgate and New Spitalfields Fruit and Vegetable Market in a new vast multi-market site. A millennium of sheep and meat trading on the same smooth field may soon face the chop. Chapter 8. Scouring and Spinning. Fairies, fleece grease, and extra soft loo roll. In the 1850s, a young draper named Thomas Burberry ran a small clothing shop in the centre of Basingstoke. One day, or so the story goes, Thomas was chatting with one of his regular customers, a local shepherd who bought his smocks at the shop. Thomas was intrigued by the fact that after the shepherd wore his smocks for a while, the fabric seemed to become water-resistant. The shepherd told Thomas that his smock often absorbed some of the grease that came off the wool when the sheep were being handled or dipped. Could it be this, thought Burberry, that helped the smock repel moisture? Burberry began to research and experiment with different fabrics, desperate to come up with a material that was both lightweight and comfortable, but also breathable and hard-wearing. Sheep's grease or lanolin proved the missing magic ingredient, the substance that could transform everyday fabric into something remarkable. The cloth Burberry invented and patented, called gabardine after the long loose outdoor cloaks worn in the Middle Ages, proved a hit and was the perfect fabric for outdoor coats, military gear and explorers' clothing. Burberry's all-weather cloth protected polar explorers such as Roald Amundsen, Robert Scott and Ernest Shackleton on their perilous Antarctic journeys, and was used to make over 500,000 trench coats for British Tommies in the First World War. How deliciously ironic that Burberry, now a luxury fashion brand, started life with a shepherd, a smock, and a liberal smearing of sheep's grease. Burberry's stroke of genius was his recognition that lanolin is a remarkable substance. Produced by the sebaceous glands in the skin, its purpose is to coat the wool fibres, giving both the skin and the fleece an extra layer of protection against the elements, a kind of sunscreen for sheep. To get lanolin from freshly shorn wool, you need to wash it in hot water, a process known as scouring, and then skim the grease off the surface. Along with its amazing waterproofing qualities, lanolin is also an exceptional emollient for softening the skin, and it's been used in cosmetics and cures for thousands of years. The Greek physician Dioscorides mentions the softening properties of lanolin as early as the 1st century AD. Describing a kind of poultice made from wool, he writes, "The best unwashed wool is softest, like that from the neck and from the thighs. It is good, moistened in vinegar and oil or wine, as first treatment for wounds, bruises, peeling, black and blue bruises, and broken bones. For it easily drinks up the liquors into which it is dipped, and by reason of the aesipum, lanolin, that it contains, it is softening." The use of lanolin is mentioned in several early pharmacopoeias, including Dispensarium Coloniensi of 1565. but it was also a staple ingredient in homemade cures throughout the centuries. Women were often expected to take on much of the routine medical care in the household, pulling ingredients from the garden and making various cures from what was to hand in the kitchen. In the Middle Ages, lanolin was a key ingredient for the home-based healer, along with vinegar, wine and honey. Since it is readily absorbed into the skin, lanolin makes the ideal carrier for other medicinal ingredients, but it also has a slight antiseptic quality, helping skin to heal itself and making it an age-old dermatological treatment for everything from burns and nappy rash to cracked nipples and eczema. Without sheep's lanolin, we also wouldn't have most of the cosmetics and personal care products we've come to rely on. Lip balms, shampoos, conditioners, lotions, and many makeup products. Oil of Olay, one of the most famous beauty products to emerge after the Second World War, originally contained lanolin as one of its key ingredients. It was invented in 1952 when the South African chemist Graham Wolfe decided to create a face cream for his wife that emulated the properties of a young woman's skin. He struggled to find a name for it, but after messing around with the letters in the word lanolin, he came up with the name Oil of Olay. In fact, look a little closer, and you find lanolin as a surprise ingredient in the strangest of places. Medieval knights would coat their arms and armour with sheep's grease to prevent rust, an anti-corrosion technique that's still employed in engineering and boat building today. Lanolin greases the wheels and cogs of machinery, lubricates brass instruments, softens baseball gloves, creates shoe polish, and even pops up in concrete waterproofing products, aircraft glues, conveyor belt wax, and extra soft loo paper. The Romans also knew the magical properties of lanolin, a byproduct of their vast wool industry. Wool was the major textile during the Roman period, and certain regions became synonymous with fleece production. In Italy, the Po Valley, the Alps, Liguria and Calabria became centres for sheep raising, while Spain, northern Gaul, Greece and Asia Minor also provided important sources of high-quality wool to feed the empire's incessant demand for fine cloth. Different regions became expert at breeding sheep with different coloured wools. Northern Italy specialised in pure white wool. Spain produced excellent black and deep brown red fleeces, while Majorca exported grey and black raw wool. And while certain regions acquired a reputation for producing high-quality woolen cloth on a large scale, there was also a brisk cottage industry in woolen production, run in the main by women. Sources from both the Greek and Roman periods seem to show a world where all women were expected to spin and weave from infancy. The arrival of a baby girl, for example, would be celebrated by hanging streamers of wool from the doorpost. Most houses would have had a workshop, a room set aside for women of the household, whether it was the wife, children, or female slaves, to spin wool ready for weaving. The ability to work wool skillfully was seen as an essential and virtuous skill for women of all backgrounds, from the indentured to the highest born. To turn wool fibres into thread, they were first rolled around a long stick called a distaff. This stopped the fibres getting tangled, but the distaff could also be held in one hand or under the arm while teasing out the fibres with the other. As you gently pulled the wool fibres from the distaff with your thumb and 2 fingers to create a thread, a spindle and haul, a stick with a weight attached, was fastened to the other end of the thread left to dangle, keeping the fibres taut. The spinning motion of the spindle, helped by the weight of the haul, then twisted the wool fibres into yarn. Pulling the fibres and creating a yarn of any consistency and length was a fine art. Skilled spinners were admired for their handiwork. In the admiring words of the Roman poet Ovid, "Nor would the work, when finished, please so much as while she wrought to view each graceful touch, whether the shapeless wool in balls she wound, or, with quick motion, turned the spindle round." The importance of knowing how to spin carried on well into the medieval period and beyond. Gervase Markham, in his 1623 work, The English Housewife, advises, "Our English housewife, after her knowledge of preserving and feeding her family, must learn also how, out of her own endeavours, she ought to clothe them outwardly and inwardly. After your wool is thus mixed, you shall then spin it up on great wool wheels, according to the order of good housewifery. Shakespeare, writing just a few years before Markham, plays with the imagery and meaning of distaffs and spinning. In Twelfth Night, Sir Toby Belch taunts Sir Andrew Aguecheek outrageously, describing his hair in mocking terms. "It hangs like flax on a distaff. And I hope to see a housewife take thee between her legs and spin it off." What he's really saying, and the audience would have fallen about at the bawdy joke, is that Sir Andrew's hair looks like a chaotic fibrous lump, and his best bet is to sleep with the prostitute and catch a venereal disease that will make it all fall out. The word distaff also symbolised the female domain, an emblem of women's place in society. In King Lear, the ageing monarch's vicious daughter Goneril rejects the role of obedient wife and seeks to upset gender norms. Upon discovering her husband Albany's reluctance to fight, she claims, "I must change arms at home and give the distaff into my husband's hands." Shakespeare's audiences would have been both shocked and thrilled at Goneril's dramatic challenge to her husband's masculinity and her sneering suggestion that he was only fit for domestic duties. There are a number of medieval depictions of women hitting men with distaffs, the emasculating symbolism not difficult to decipher. In one etching, by the 15th century German printmaker Israel van Meckenem, a woman forces a man to wind yarn, a task that people would have regarded as beneath men, while thrashing him with her distaff. She's also pulling on what looks like a pair of men's underpants, an early version of the woman subverting her socially ordained role by wearing the trousers. In Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, the host's wife proposes a reversal of traditional gender roles to express her fury at her husband's failure to defend her honour. "By corpus bones, I will have thy knife, and thou shalt have my distaff and go spin," she cries. Images of the enraged, distaff-wielding wife thrashing a timid husband crop up in some unlikely places. In the august surroundings of Westminster Abbey, we find a carving on a misericorde, hinged oak seat, showing a man having his bare bottom beaten by his wife, apparently for breaking her distaff. The battle of the sexes is also played out in medieval illustrations of distaffs and jousting, with several showing women charging towards unarmed men, distaffs aloft and ready for a fight. The word distaff is still used today, albeit rarely, as an adjective to describe women's concerns or the mother's side of a family. Female horse races are also called distaff races. Thoroughbred fillies and mares can still compete in the Breeders' Cup Distaff, held annually at a different racetrack in the United States or Canada. The idea of the woman who spins provides us with the English word spinster, a term that still weighs heavy with negative connotations, but for the Greeks and Romans, far from conjuring up a disapproving image of an unmarried woman, the spinner was the epitome of the idealized matrona, or wife of an honourable man. The spinster's work symbolized the correct order of life, where women stayed at home, contributing to the self-sufficiency of the household. In Homer's poems from the time, for example, virtually every woman mentioned, including royalty and goddesses, are involved in spinning or creating cloth in some way. In fact, spinning forms an integral part of many different mythologies and notions of the cosmos. In Plato's Republic, he describes the axis of the universe as a shaft of a spindle. The Greek fates spin the thread of human life. Theseus finds his way out of the labyrinth using Ariadne's spun thread. In the southwestern United States, Navajo culture has its own spider woman who taught their ancestors how to spin and weave. And in Inca folklore, the fertility goddess Mama Ocllo was said to have passed on the art of spinning to Inca women. Even children's fairy tales are full of spinning, from bedtime favourites such as Sleeping Beauty and Rumpelstiltskin to lesser-known folk stories such as the Habitrot of the border counties of northern England and southern Scotland, or the Czech golden spinning wheel. What's common to many of these tales is the positive, almost mystical power of spinning. For many girls, young women, mothers and wives, spinning would have been a valuable source of independent income. and a way of boosting the family coffers while still taking care of children or managing a household. Across European folklore, there are dozens of folk tales which feature heroines who spin. Through their craft, they are able to save other characters, lift curses, and bring about a happy ending. The spinning is not only a means to an end in these tales, but a powerful metaphor about drawing together separate elements to form a single, unbreakable thread. Spinning and weaving was also, in European folklore, linked to the world of fairies and magic. Scottish woolen weavers often made offerings of milk to the Loirig, a Highland fairy specifically responsible for overseeing the making of cloth. Berta, a Germanic winter spirit, was said to have one foot flatter than the other from constantly pounding her spinning wheel. Domika, a Russian household fairy, lived under the floorboards and came out at night to spin. Both Gerl Gwerl, an Irish fairy spinner, and Gwarwynethroth, a Welsh fairy spinner and weaver, made clothes for needy families. Of all the activities attributed to fairies, spinning and weaving are the most common. Writing at the end of the 17th century, Robert Kirk, minister and witchcraft expert, describes the she or fairy folk. Their women are said to spin very fine, to dye, to tissue and embroider. But whether it is as manual operation of substantial refined stuffs, with apt and solid instruments, or only curious cobwebs, impalpable rainbows, and a fantastic imitation of the actions of more terrestrial mortals, since it transcended all the senses of the seer to discern whether, I leave to conjecture as I found it. But why would fairies be linked with wool spinning? As we know, the ancient Greeks had the story of the Fates, the three weaving goddesses who controlled the destiny of mankind. The same tale, slightly tweaked, turns up in various forms throughout history and across different cultures, such as the three Norns in Norse storytelling and the sisters Deives Valdietoios in Baltic folklore. In Roman mythology, the three goddesses were known as the Parcae or Fata, plural of fatum or that which has been spoken. The word fata, over time, became fée and fairy in Old French, and fairy in Middle English. Fairies until recently weren't thought of as benevolent, tutu-clad bringers of tooth money. They were capricious, otherworldly creatures, capable of both help and harm, fickle changers of destiny. So when we read our children bedtime tales of fairies, we are plugging into a 2,000-year-old story about the Fates, those wool-spinning mistresses of human destiny. Wool spinning was also a key part of daily life for Viking women, a reality reflected in much of their mythology. Along with the three Norns, the Vikings also believed in Seder, from the Old Norse Seidr, meaning thread, a type of magic or shamanism which dealt with fate and the possibility of changing the outcome of events. There were Seder rituals for auspicious occasions, for seeing into the future and bringing good luck, for revealing deeply held secrets, for healing and controlling the weather, for encouraging success in hunts and fishing. But Seder also had a dark side and could be used as a terrible curse, to wish ill or death on a person or a community, to induce disaster and accidents, or to blight the land or set someone on a road to ruin. Crucially, Seder was seen as women's magic, and so it's no coincidence that to perform a ritual, the practitioner held a distaff in her hand, before entering into a trance-like state in order to communicate with the spirit world. Women and spinning were intimately linked, but unlike in Greek and Roman culture, where every woman spun, in the Viking world, it was very much the middle-class woman's prerogative. The Old Norse poem Riksthula, written sometime between the 10th and 13th centuries, gives us a glimpse of who did what, depending on social class. In it, the slave woman wears old clothes and serves food. The aristocratic woman preens herself and drinks wine, and it is the woman of the yeoman class, the land-owning farmers, who is busy with her spindle and loom. Archaeological evidence, including more than 9,000 textile fragments, indicate that spinning and weaving was practiced at nearly every excavated Norse farm in Iceland and Greenland. Indeed, spindle whorls turn up with pleasing regularity in Viking female burials all over northern Europe. Women were often buried in the best clothes, with several spindle whorls for company. Quite why, we don't know. One thought is that the spindle whorl was a kind of emblem or talisman of the home, or perhaps the Vikings thought of the whorl as a woman's tool, a symbol of her domestic power and the perfect offering to keep the deceased occupied in her next life. Different kinds of spindle whorls turn up in female Viking graves, some plain, some fancy, some made from everyday objects, others from valuable, rare materials. Across the Viking world, women's burials are littered with whorls made from materials as diverse as amber, elk antler, bone, clay, coral, glass, metal, wood, sandstone, and slate. Some women's graves have one or two, others have handfuls. The variety of whorls in each grave may have been a display of spinning proficiency, a skilled spinner showing her expertise by being buried with lots of different kinds and weights of wool, which, in life, would have allowed her to spin different kinds of woolen yarn. An apprentice or basic spinner may have had, conversely, only one or two whorls to her name. In death, as in life, a Viking woman's status, wealth and skill could be represented through her physical possessions. Interestingly, it was a Viking spindle whorl that turned up in Lance O'Meadows, Newfoundland, which proved not only that Viking warriors had made the arduous journey from Greenland to the New World at least 1,000 years ago, but that their womenfolk came along too. In another twist, recent findings have also exploded the idea that the advanced Vikings must have brought the art of spinning to the native Inuit people. Science has shown that the Inuit were spinning yarn hundreds of years before the Vikings arrived. Not only that, but Viking and Inuit spinners may have actually swapped techniques, like a spinning bee, with the Norse women learning how to use hair from other animals such as muskox, foxes and Arctic hares alongside their own imported sheep. Indeed, Viking voyages and their colonisation of distant lands were only possible because of sheep. Norse ships travelled huge distances from Scandinavia, hugging the coasts of Europe and using the lakes and rivers of Russia and Germany to trade with Asian and Arab countries. They also struck out for new lands to settle, plunging into the unknown waters that eventually took them to Iceland, Greenland, and eventually North America. While Norsemen were skilled sailors and terrifying warriors, they wouldn't have survived their great journeys without the wool that made their clothes, bedding, and even the sails that carried them overseas, most of which were crafted by women and girls. The packing list for a Viking sailor consisted of clothing mostly made from wool. Apart from their leather oilskins, crew members would have worn tunics, socks, gloves, hats, and cloaks, all made from sheep's wool, either woven or nulebound, an early form of knitting, with maybe a thick woolen rug to snuggle under. But it was the sail that was the game changer. Roughly speaking, the Vikings used two kinds of ships. The langskip, or longship, was an elongated, flat, narrow vessel built primarily for speed and agility, with multiple oarsmen placed along the entire length of the deck for maximum propulsion. The longships had shallow drafts, perfect for navigating shallow rivers and hugging coastlines, and were light enough to be picked up by the crew and carried over land. This made them ideal for fast and furious beach landings and raids. Other European ships of the time needed deep water or harbours to land. Norse raiders, with their shallow drafts, found they could venture further inland than any of their enemies, strike quickly, and then make a quick escape from any shelving beach. For long-distance trade and sea exploration, however, a different kind of vessel was needed. The knar, or trade ship, was the shorter, stockier cousin to the longship. It relied almost entirely on sail power, only resorting to oars when the winds failed to blow. Crews were also smaller on trade ships. Fewer men meant profits were greater when shared out. It also had more space for carrying and collecting goods. With fewer hands on deck to row, however, the sail was pivotal to the success of the knar's voyage. Densely woven strips of woolen cloth were sewn together to create vast, billowing, brightly coloured sheets that could withstand whatever the North Atlantic could throw at it, or, if the weather got really bad, be lowered over the ship and fastened down like a tent to shield the sailors inside. Wool might seem a strange choice for a sail, but the key to its success was in its stretchability. Sailing across the ocean, The Knar would have been subject to many a fierce storm or sudden blast of wind. Wool, with its almost magical elasticity, resistance to tearing and shock-absorbing qualities, could take it all in its stride. The colours would have been dazzling too. Analysis of pollen in a Viking dyer's workshop found a rich variety of plants were used to dye the woolen fabric, from chicory black to flax dodder red, goosefoot root yellow to nettle leaves green. What's startling is just how much wool would have been needed to create a single sail. Amy Lightfoot, textile researcher and head of the Thermavik Textile Trust in Hitra, Norway, worked out that to make a sail big enough to power a 98-foot, 30-metre boat, which could carry 60 men, you'd need the fleeces of about 700 sheep. It would also have taken longer, she calculated, to make the sail than to build the actual ship, by about a factor of 20. Based on 2 people working on the task, it would have taken about a fortnight to craft a ship, compared to a year to weave a sail. Meanwhile, Danish researchers working at the Viking Ship Museum in Roskilde totted up that the entire Viking fleet by AD 1050 would have needed 1.2 million square yards, 1 million square metres, of woolen sailcloth, a feat of manufacture only possible with the help of 2 million sheep. That's sheep farming on a monumental scale, not to mention the extensive web of spinners and weavers needed to transform the raw fleece into woolen cloth. The Vikings needed plenty of land to graze all the sheep required to service their ship's needs and domestic wool demand. There simply wasn't enough grazing on Viking soil. In a self-perpetuating cycle, the more the Vikings pushed ahead, trading, colonising and plundering the lands they encountered, the more foreign pasture land, it seems, they also needed to capture. What the Vikings couldn't produce themselves, they bought from neighbouring countries. Of all the goods that Britain and Ireland had to offer, for example, the Vikings chose to buy wheat, honey, tin, and, crucially, cloth. By the closing years of the 10th century and into the 11th, there is evidence of woolen fabric produced in the North Sea region ending up in Norway via Viking trade. The 13th century Egil's Saga mentions a ship sailing to England to buy woolen cloth and other goods he needed, while King Sverre of Norway is said to have praised all those Englishmen who brought wheat and honey, flour and cloth to his country. Sheep didn't just contribute the wool for Viking ship sails, they provided tallow to waterproof the sails, salted meat for the journey, a live commodity to trade once they'd arrived, coarse hair to make lightweight rope and fishing line, and a means of making a living if they decided to settle. Sheep also helped to make the long ships watertight. Their wool, mixed with tar or tallow, was used to stuff the spaces between the wooden planks. And during the night, rather than sleep at sea, Vikings often pulled their longships up on beaches, where they'd take down the woolen sail and lay it across the ship as a tarpaulin, or they put up woolen tents on land close to shore. The survival of ancient Viking breeds of sheep in pockets across Europe gives us a direct link with the past. Viking sheep were smaller and hardier than modern commercial breeds, perfectly suited to difficult terrain and minimum tending. They also naturally shed their wool every year, at least partially, making it likely that Vikings would have rued or plucked the wool from their sheep rather than attempted to shear them. Many of these breeds still live on in isolated communities, or, thanks to the work of rare breed trusts, the Norwegian Spelsau, the Icelandic sheep, the Swedish Gutta, native to the island of Gotland, the Soay and Hebridean in northwest Scotland, the island sheep of Ouessant off the northwesternmost point of France, and the Manx Loatan from the Isle of Man are living reminders of Norse husbandry, trade and settlement across northwestern Europe more than 1,000 years ago. In Britain, local Cumbrian folklore had long spoken of a link between the famous Herdwick sheep and the Vikings, whose farming and culture left an enduring mark on the history and landscape of the Lake District. But the connection had never been proven. However, thanks to the work of the Sheep Trust, a charity based at the University of York, scientists have shown that Herdwicks possess a primitive genome shared by breeds currently living in Sweden, Finland, Orkney and Iceland. The folklore, it turns out, was right. Chapter 9. Knit for Victory. The world's oldest socks, workhouses, and how wool helped win the war. In 1914, when English collector John de Monins Johnson was sifting through finds in the Egyptian city of Antinopolis, he was hoping to discover some dazzling examples of ancient papyrus. Imagine his disappointment when he found 2 dusty old woolen socks instead. And worse still, they didn't even match. Dismissed as curiosities at the time, these slightly shabby pieces of footwear are now viewed as spectacular survivors of ancient Romano-Egyptian culture dating to around AD 100 to 400 and the oldest woolen socks ever found. At first, textile historians thought they had been knitted, but on closer examination, it turned out that they had been created using a much earlier technique, knitting's cooler, much older cousin known as knålebinding. On the surface, knålebinding and knitting produce remarkably similar results, but the techniques aren't quite the same. While knitting uses continuous lengths of wool, 2 or more needles, and a series of interlocking loops which can be unravelled, knålebinding needs only 1 needle, short lengths of wool, and involves sewing the loops together. And while knitting seems to have been a relatively late developer around the 12th century AD, knålebinding has a truly ancient pedigree. The word knålebinding translates in some Scandinavian languages to needle binding, and it's interesting that some of the earliest examples of this technique come from Denmark. At one site, a fishing village called Tubrent Vig that was occupied between 5400 and 4000 BC, fragments of a knålebound fishing net were discovered. The net wasn't made from wool, however, but strands of vegetable fibres. It seems knitting, or at least its predecessor, didn't start with woolly jumpers, but our ancestors' unending search for food. A quick glance at knitting's linguistic heritage is also telling. The words knit, knot, and net are all related, branches from the same archaic Proto-Indian European root, ned, meaning to twist, bind, or tie. Perhaps given its origins, it's no surprise that the Vikings were expert wool knålebinders. Across Russia, Finland, Norway, Denmark, Sweden, and Britain, archaeologists have uncovered woolen clothing, or at least fragments, that suggest the Vikings were whipping up mittens, headwear, trimmings, stockings, and most of all, socks, made from local sheep's wool. One example, the Coppergate sock, which was found under the yard of a 10th century wattle building in York, is so perfectly preserved you can even make out the shape of the wearer's foot and the place it was lovingly darned at the heel. About the length of a school ruler with a dainty pointed toe, it looks as comfortable as any modern-day trainer sock, and yet it represents a key moment in British history, when the north of England fell under Viking rule for over 100 years. True knitting, the fast, clackety, 2-needled kind, seems to have evolved centuries later, perhaps developing from some of the stitches used in knålebinding. We know frustratingly little about its beginnings, but knitting is generally thought to have evolved somewhere in the Middle East, between the 6th and 11th centuries, from where it wound its way into Spain via Muslim knitters employed by the royal palaces and into the rest of Europe. The Victoria and Albert Museum holds the earliest scrap of true knitting ever found, a gorgeous cream and blue stocking from North Africa. Made around 1100 to 1300 during a period of Islamic rule, sporting a Fair Isle pattern that wouldn't look out of place in a Ralph Lauren winter catwalk collection. By the 1400s, knitted clothing had tangled itself into all sections of European society, from king to clergy, lord to pauper. As a craft, knitting led a double life. On one hand, items of breathtaking skill and intricacy were being made for high-status individuals and institutions. Cushion covers, liturgical gloves, wall hangings, and so on. Knitting at this level was an occupation regulated by hand-knitting guilds, run for and by men, which laid down strict rules for entry and practice. The Knitters' Guild in Paris during the 1400s, for example, required an apprentice to serve 7 years before he could call himself a master craftsman. The job title could only be bestowed on someone who had proved he could design a pair of smart stockings, gloves, a shirt, a waistcoat, and a carpet, and knit all 5 items in 10 weeks or less. Even if a man achieved the status of master, the guild continued to keep a beady eye on his work, dishing out tough penalties or threatening expulsion for shoddy workmanship. The reputation of the guilds kept standards and, crucially, prices high. Henry VIII of England even boasted that the stockings he wore were hand-knitted by the master craftsmen of Paris. But it's not the high-status, extravagant wool knitting that has the most interesting story. Knitting, because it's a portable, simple craft that doesn't require any expensive equipment, suited the pockets and time constraints of people working in rural subsistence communities or fishing villages. It was a way for poor neighbourhoods to make their own garments, clothes for their families, and, most importantly, a means of earning a few extra pennies to supplement their meagre wages. The denizens of marginal agricultural areas and coastal villages could boost their wages by knitting gloves, caps and stockings, often while carrying out other day-to-day chores or paid work. Shepherds knitted alongside their flocks, for example, fisherwomen while waiting for the catch to come in, market traders while selling their wares. Shetland Museum has the most amazing archive of photographs of crofters, many from the late 1800s. In one, 2 women lug vast baskets on their backs, called kishies, which they used to collect peat for fuel. As they trudge along, baskets loaded, they're also knitting stockings, a feat that seems almost heroic in its multitasking. Another from 1939 shows a girl of no more than 3 or 4 years of age, seated, knitting. As if it wasn't remarkable enough that a preschooler had already grasped the complexities of 2-needle knitting, she's also wearing a professional knitting belt, or, as Shetlanders would call it, a mackin belt, a leather strap worn around the waist into which the end of a double-pointed knitting needle is slotted, so a knitter can work quickly and for long periods of time without getting tired. Knitting probably arrived in Shetland via England sometime during the 1600s. The earliest knitted finds come from a 17th century grave of a young man who was buried with a knitted stocking, gloves, a purse and 2 caps, and by the beginning of the 1700s the islanders realised they could trade knitted woolen stockings and blankets in exchange for cash or goods from Dutch and German merchants. Here, and in other regional communities across the British Isles, people knitted while they walked to market, when they huddled around the evening hearth or sat aboard sailing boats. Men, women and children would knit at any available opportunity, at home, in the field, on journeys. In 1595 it's estimated that around 100,000 people in England were working in the domestic knitting trade. For many people, therefore, knitting wool represented more than just a useful craft. From the end of the 16th century to well into the up, and for second offence to be adjudged a felon and to suffer death accordingly. A similar fate was promised for anyone in the colonies caught trading in wool. The settlers were defiant, however, and not only managed to quickly build a cottage cloth industry, but also had the audacity, in British eyes, to start trading with one another and with European countries. Wool production became so important that by 1662, Virginia was offering £5 of tobacco, the unit of currency at the time, for every yard of wool cloth made in its own colony. And by 1664, Massachusetts had brought in a law that required children to learn how to spin and weave wool. Supply could barely keep up with demand. One academic has estimated that every adult in a household would need 30 to 40 yards of wool just to have enough for basic clothing. With 30,000 adults living in New England by 1665, this equates to roughly 1.2 million yards, 1,098,000 metres of wool fabric. All this wool-related economic activity provoked the fury of the King of England. In 1699, William III issued an act to prevent the exportation of wool out of the kingdoms of Ireland and England into foreign parts and for the encouragement of the woolen manufactures in the Kingdom of England. It was designed with 3 express aims. First, to force the colonies to only import British wool. Second, to ban colonists from exporting wool out of America. And third, to tax any sales of wool. The wearing of homespun wool cloth by the colonists, which was often a blend of wool and linen called linsey, woolsey or wincey, became a mark of defiance and symbol of patriotism. Families, communities and church groups would hold spinning bees to see who could make the most woolen yarn, often taking the opportunity to discuss political issues of the day. Women, by creating and buying homespun textiles and boycotting British ones, were seen as key figures of civil disobedience in the colonial resistance. When the college that would later become Brown University was first founded in Providence, Rhode Island in the 1760s, the president deliberately wore homespun clothing during the inaugural ceremony. Over at Harvard in Massachusetts, both teaching staff and scholars also wore homespun clothing in solidarity. And while there were many subsequent efforts by Britain to control and stifle American trade, such as the Sugar Act of 1764 and the Tea Act of 1773, it was the Wool Act of 1699 that sowed the first stitches of rebellion and anger in the colonies that led ultimately to America's Revolutionary War between 1775 and 1783 and its Declaration of Independence. By the time of the Revolutionary War, colonial women were so used to clothing their families in homespun fabrics and hand-knitted garments that it came as no surprise when they were asked to provide clothing and blankets for the soldiers who were going into battle on their behalf. A clothier general was appointed to assess the army's requirements for bedding and uniform. Vast quantities of knitters were needed if the army was going to keep its men warm. Towns published the names and knitting tallies of their inhabitants to encourage a spirit of competition, and women from all walks of life, including George Washington's wife Martha, who became the inaugural First Lady of the United States, were encouraged to add their contribution, however small. Desperate reports from the front line of soldiers poorly dressed and fighting in bare feet kept knitters at their needles, often recycling old textiles into new stockings, blankets and breeches for the boys. The plight of American soldiers and women's efforts to clothe them was also later immortalised in Louisa May Alcott's Little Women, 1880, set during the Civil War in the early 1860s. Beth said nothing, but wiped away her tears with the blue army sock and began to knit with all her might, losing no time in doing the duty that lay nearest her, while she resolved in her quiet little soul to be all that Father hoped to find her when the year brought round the happy coming home. Our heroine Jo, however, finds the task of knitting socks for the war and its gendered undertones a little more irksome. "It's bad enough to be a girl anyway when I like boys' games and work and manners. I can't get over my disappointment in not being a boy. And it's worse than ever now, for I'm dying to go and fight with Papa. And I can only stay home and knit like a poky old woman." And Jo shook the blue army sock till the needles rattled like castanets, and her ball bounded across the room. Knitting also has a rich and fascinating heritage as an innocent front for covert deeds and spying. Again, in the American Revolutionary War, as the British occupied Philadelphia, legend tells of one tavern owner, Molly Old Mom Rinker, who would listen in on enemy soldiers whose tongues had been loosened by alcohol. Conversations she'd overhear in her pub during the evening about troop movements or enemy strategy would be quickly scribbled down and then tucked into balls of wool. During the day, she'd walk to her favourite rocky mound and sit and knit socks, while surreptitiously lowering her message-laden balls of wool over the edge of the cliff behind her and into the hands of a colonial dispatch rider. Knitting was also the perfect vehicle for coded messages. By making a specific pattern, messages could be hidden in an innocent run of stitches or a custom-made piece of clothing. During both World Wars, the Belgian resistance enlisted old women to live in houses with views of railway stations or lines. As vehicles and trains came and went, the women would add different stitches into their knitting. Knit one for a train, pearl one for an artillery vehicle, and so on, which could then be handed on to fellow spies. Wool yarn suited Morse code-style messages perfectly, with different knots being read as either dots or dashes. Far from being a twee idea, the authorities treated it with deadly seriousness. During the Second World War, for example, America's Office of Censorship banned knitting patterns being posted abroad just in case they might contain sensitive coded information. But often, just the act of knitting was enough of a disguise. No one suspected women, gently working away with their wool, were using the activity as a cover for espionage. One American, Elizabeth Bentley, who initially spied for the Soviets during the Second World War before defecting and becoming an informer for the FBI, famously used her knitting bag to conceal classified information and aircraft plans that she'd stolen. Another who used knitting as a cover for sending secret messages was the French woman Madame Levangel. During the First World War, she would watch German troop movements from her bedroom window while knitting and tapping her foot on the floor. Meanwhile, her children downstairs, who were busy pretending to do homework, would jot down the sequence of taps, all under the nose of a German guard posted in their home. The British had their own knitting spy too. In 1944, at only 23 years of age, secret agent Phyllis Latour Doyle was parachuted into Nazi-occupied Normandy to gather intelligence of the forthcoming D-Day landings. In just a few short months, posing as a poor 14-year-old French girl, Doyle relayed 135 coded messages which she would hide in her knitting before passing them on to the British military. For all its allo charm to modern eyes, the mission was hugely risky. Talking to a magazine journalist later in life, Doyle recalled, "The men who had been sent just before me were caught and executed. I was told I was chosen for that area of France because I would arouse less suspicion." While many examples of knitting codes come from the era of the two world wars, it wasn't a new idea. In 1859, Dickens famously created the character of Madame Defarge in A Tale of Two Cities, who takes great pleasure from knitting while she watches the guillotine slice its way through the French nobility. As she sits and coolly sees heads roll, she knits the names of the victims into her knitting as a kind of roll call of revenge. Her character was based on real-life tricoteuses, working-class women who would take their knitting to public executions and fastidiously clack away while watching the spectacle unfold. Denied access to any form of legitimate assembly, the tricoteuses gathered instead as spectators, all the while knitting, among other things, liberty caps for the revolutionaries. While most tricoteuses were probably just sullen observers, fictional accounts often treated them as bloodthirsty voyeurs. Baroness Orczy's novel The Scarlet Pimpernel, 1908, paints the picture with grisly glee. The women who drove the carts usually spent their day on the Place de la Grève, beneath the platform of the guillotine, knitting and gossiping, whilst they watched the rows of tumbrils arriving with the victims the reign of terror claimed every day. It was great fun to see the aristos arriving for the reception of Madame la Guillotine, and the places close by the platform were very much sought after. Bibot, during the day, had been on duty on the Place. He recognised most of the old hags, tricoteuses as they were called, who sat there and knitted whilst head after head fell beneath the knife, and they themselves got quite bespattered with the blood of those cursed aristos. But perhaps the most famous examples of wool and war work, however, are the Knit for Victory campaigns. During the First World War, knitting fever swept across Britain. Soldiers' letters describing appalling trench conditions and freezing temperatures spurred women, children and men who were unable to serve to start making and sending items of knitwear in their millions. Socks, gloves, mittens, balaclavas, vests, blankets and sweaters were fashioned in vast numbers by loved ones desperate to raise morale on the front and feel part of the war effort. Magazines, posters and knitting patterns of the day urged eager knitters to knit a bit for the war effort and show our boys they were not forgotten. Guides were issued to show knitters how to create essential bits of kit. The British Journal of Nursing offered guidance on mufflers, The graphic newspaper showed how old socks and stockings could be repurposed as mittens, and The Queen magazine published how-to guides on knitting for needy soldiers, including instructions for how to make rifle gloves, balaclavas with ear flaps, and knitted leg warmers. Other patterns were copied from women's magazines such as Woman's Own, or charity booklets designed specifically to help clothe servicemen abroad. Even wool companies got in on the act. The British firm Weldon's printed dozens of designs, many of them remarkably specialised for the amateur knitter. In their pamphlet, Garments and Hospital Comforts for Our Soldiers and Sailors, women at home were encouraged to create a raft of military and therapeutic garments, including woolen helmets with ear openings, stockings, abdominal belts, heelless day socks, convertible scarves, knitted finger stools, bed socks, sea boot stockings for sailors, and even knitted eye bandages. The pamphlet also suggested that ladies took notes into their knitted presents with messages of support such as "God protect you," "Everyone is thinking of you," and "Good luck to you brave men." Some of the soldiers who received their woolen gifts felt compelled to write back, thanking the knitter for their efforts. Archives from St John's, Newfoundland, include a note written by Edward Noftel, aged 19, to a Miss Clark of Twillingate in the summer of 1918. Dear Miss Clark, just a note thanking you for the socks, which were very nice indeed, and in such a place as France. I know that people in Twillingate must work hard working for the soldiers of Newfoundland. I don't know if I know any of your friends out here, but I can tell you that all the boys that are here at present are feeling well. My address is 83 E.G. Noftel, 1st Royal Newfoundland Regiment, BEF, France. Your friend, Ted. In their letters home, some soldiers made promises to visit the women who had knitted their socks. For a lucky few, it was the beginning of a new friendship or love affair. Not for poor Edward, however. Only a few months after writing his thank-you note to Miss Clark, and just weeks before the end of the war, Edward died from appendicitis in a Belgian hospital some 2,500 miles, 4,000 kilometres from home. Not all woolly contributions were as well received as others, however. Knitting skills back home varied enormously, as did the quality of the yarn. Magazines such as Tatler featured humorous cartoons poking gentle fun at rogue knitters and their efforts, while one New Zealand soldier's poem of the time reads, "Life of a pair of socks. They are some fit. I used one for a helmet and the other for a mitt. Glad to hear you're doing your bit. But who the said you could knit?" When the United States joined the Allied effort in April 1917, knitting became a patriotic duty there too. The US government quickly set to work securing essential equipment for the soldiers, and while they managed to scrape together the basics needed for survival, including heavy overcoats, American soldiers were woefully undersupplied with warm garments such as hats, gloves, and jumpers. The American Red Cross sprang into action, handing out woolen yarn and knitting patterns, demanding that everyone, from prisoners to pensioners, knit for Sammy. Even President Wilson and his wife Edith got involved by allowing sheep to graze the grass in front of the White House, and then auctioning off the wool, raising thousands of dollars for the American Red Cross. The campaign to mobilize American knitters paid off. In just a year and a half, US citizens knitted over 24 million items of clothing for soldiers. People click-clacked away at home, at work, on public transport, and even at play. In California, female lifeguards knitted on the beach. In Seattle, a jury knitted as they mulled over a verdict. The New York Philharmonic Society was even forced to issue a plea to audience members to stop disrupting performances with their incessant knitting. Men got in on the act too. Firemen knitted through their watch, train conductors between stations, injured soldiers in their recovery wards knitted. Even the inmates of America's prisons did their bit with needle and wool. Over in Australia, civilian groups also knitted throughout the Great War, coordinated through organisations such as the Comforts Fund and the Soldiers' Sock Fund, who also provided instructional talks to steer knitters in the right direction. Over 1.3 million socks were sent overseas from Australia. Demand often outstripped supply. Not only did knitters have to keep up a furious pace to keep up with soldiers' needs, but there simply weren't enough needles to go round. Ever resourceful, the inhabitants of the state of Victoria turned bicycle spokes into knitting needles and even sold on those converted spokes that they did not need to other states. Wool was also in fierce demand. Before the First World War, Australia had an almost complete monopoly of world wool production. With the outbreak of war, the UK government asked Australia to stop exporting its wool to anywhere except Britain, leading to a steep drop in wool prices. Only after lengthy negotiations in 1916 did the British government agree to buy Australia's entire wool production for the rest of the war at a fairer rate, 55% more than the pre-war price. The country's wool industry recovered, but with wool in short supply, Australia needed to find an alternative. Soon a scheme was in place to send sheepskin vests for every Australian soldier posted abroad. By the end of the year, 150,000 sheepskin vests, stitched together by volunteers, were warming the backs of Australian boys fighting in the trenches of the Western Front. The huge effort that wool knitters put into military clothing and blankets paid off. Not only did the free labour of volunteers supplement those domestic textile industries struggling to keep pace with demand, but the health benefits of warm woolen clothes helped Allied soldiers tough out and ultimately win a war in which cold and wet were as deadly an enemy as the German army. The knitting campaign also had an emotional impact on soldiers, reminding them of support back home and on the knitters left behind who wanted desperately to connect and help. Knitted clothes represented a physical link to home, family, and the loving embrace of a sweetheart. Mothers, daughters, fathers, and other family members knitted garments in the knowledge that these might be the last clothes a young soldier ever wore, and that they might end with him, blood-stained and far from home. Who could have guessed that only a few years later many of the same people who had knitted for victory in the First World War would be called on to do the same again in a second global conflict? As Time magazine announced in 1940, "The men hardly have time to grab their guns before their wives and sweethearts grab their needles and yarn." For them, knitting was a familiar and immediate reaction to war, despite the fact that, by this time, machine knitting was much more efficient. Alongside claims from knitters that handcrafted textiles were more robust than factory ones, and that hand knitting didn't use up precious fuel or machinery, civilians knitted for victory because, for their own sanity, they had to. In the words of an article printed in the New York Times in January 1942, "The propaganda effect of hand knitting cannot be estimated in terms of hard cash, but it is considerable. A sweater for a blue jacket, a helmet for a flying cadet, made by some devoted woman in a small town far from the war, is sure to arouse interest in the Navy or Air Force among the friends of the woman doing the knitting. And she herself feels that she has an active part in this vast conflict. She is not useless, although she can do nothing else to help win the war." Chapter 10. Sheep hath paid for it all. Wool churches, white monks, and the crime of owling. In the space of just 1 year, between 1338 and 1339, William de la Pole, a wool merchant from Hull, lent King Edward III an eye-watering amount of cash, around £118,000, or in today's money, the best part of £167 million. And he could well afford to. By the time of his death in 1366, William was one of the richest men in England and had established the de la Pole family name as one of the great aristocratic houses. His son Michael became Earl of Suffolk, and only a century later his descendant got within a whisker of the throne when Richard III named John de la Pole as his heir. Had the outcome of the Battle of Bosworth of 1485 been different, and Henry Tudor lost, the direct descendant of a fleece dealer would have become King of England. The meteoric rise of this spectacularly successful entrepreneur from keen-eyed trader to nobility in one generation, reflects a moment in England's history when wool made the country very, very wealthy indeed. By the time William de la Pole was born, the English wool business had been trundling along for centuries. After the Romans landed on English shores in AD 43, they soon established a well-organised wool industry. The country already had its native small Soay-like horned sheep that had wandered the Isles since the Bronze Age, but we know from historical records that by AD 300, the wool that was coming out of Britain was, according to the geographer Dionysius Periegetes, so fine that it was comparable to a spider's web. One idea is that the Romans brought their own flocks over from the Mediterranean, fine white-wooled sheep that preferred the rich grasslands, marshes and fens of the south and southeast of England, regions that were to become the great wool-producing areas such as Suffolk, Norfolk and the Cotswolds. It's difficult to know what the English sheep and wool industry looked like after the Romans finally abandoned Britain in AD 410 and the years we erroneously call the Dark Ages. We just don't have many sources to draw on. But the few documents that do exist suggest plenty of people were keeping sheep, especially for wool. One of the earliest records in 697 shows King Wihtred of Kent granting pasture land for 300 sheep in ruminating Seta, now Romney Marsh, to St Mary's Church, Lyminge. In 796, Charlemagne, King of the Franks, wrote to Offa, King of Mercia in Anglo-Saxon England. The letter is the oldest surviving diplomatic document in English history and mentions, among other things, the woolen cloaks the Mercians were trading with the Franks. The letter hints at an older trading arrangement in woolen cloth. Charlemagne mentions that his subjects would dearly like to buy cloaks of the same style as they used to come us in old times. And as we saw in Chapter 5, the fact that we have hundreds of ovine place names that begin with ship, shap, shep or skip, relics of Anglo-Saxon and Norse words for sheep, suggests an early medieval world of lively sheep farming and trading both within and out of the British Isles. By the time of the Domesday Book, in 1086, sheep were the number one agricultural commodity. One survey taken soon after the Norman conquest showed there were more sheep across England than all the cows, pigs and poultry put together. Between them, the large estates in Norfolk, Suffolk, Essex, Cambridgeshire, Cornwall, Devon, Somerset and Dorset had nearly 300,000 sheep. The monks at Ely Abbey in Cambridgeshire had more than 13,000 alone. Many of the large-scale owners of sheep were monasteries or religious orders. Records from the beginning of the 12th century, for example, show a group of nuns keeping nearly 2,000 sheep grazing on Minchinhampton Common in the Cotswolds. When Richard I managed to get himself captured by Duke Leopold of Austria, on his return from a crusade at the end of the 12th century, his 150,000 marks ransom, about £200 million in today's money, was paid for, in part, by 50,000 sacks of English wool, pretty much the entire wool clip from the English Cistercian and Premonstratensian houses. Textile historians have worked out that this colossal amount of wool would have needed between 10 and 13 million sheep. That's about 4 sheep for every man, woman and child across England, Wales and Scotland combined. The rest of Richard's ransom money was scraped together by other measures, including a universal tax of 25% on all incomes, from earls and barons to merchants and yeomen, and donations of gold and silver vessels from churches. Monasteries were particularly well placed to rear sheep for wool. Many of them owned or had been gifted vast open tracts of pasture land, much of it suitable only for sheep grazing. They also had ample labour available in the form of conversi, waged farming monks, and lay workers from surrounding villages. Monasteries acted as central depots for fleeces from outlaying farms and granges, a collection point where the entire region's wool clip could be dumped, graded and bundled ready for export. The Cistercians also cornered the market in preparing wool, cannily adding value by meticulously washing, drying, sorting, weighing and carefully packaging it, a process that was often too time-consuming and costly for small-scale farmers. Interestingly, The Cistercians became known as the White Monks. It was traditional for monks to wear dark habits, but the Cistercians decided that they would shun the use of expensive dyes and instead wear undyed, off-white woolen clothing to proclaim their poverty. For some, the gesture smacked of superiority over the more ostentatious orders, such as the Benedictines. For others, the wearing of white woolen habits perfectly expressed the Cistercians' moral purity. As the Cistercian monk and writer Walter Daniel wrote in the late 12th century, "For their name arose from the fact that, as the angels might be, they were clothed in undyed wool, spun and woven from the pure fleece of sheep. So named and garbed and gathered together like flocks of seagulls, they shine as they walk with the whiteness of snow." One of the great ironies of the wool trade is that the monasteries who started sheep farming as a means of living an austere, self-sufficient life became really rather good at it. Many of the religious houses across the country became so adept at the business of wool, they started to sell futures in their own products. Wool traders would agree to buy 3 or 4 years' worth of wool in advance. They sometimes even acquired a wool clip as much as 20 years before the sheep were actually shorn. The monasteries liked this arrangement as it provided them with a means of financial planning. Wool prices could fluctuate wildly from one year to the next. It also gave them a ready source of cash for running costs, papal taxes and building works. Wool merchants liked the arrangement because it gave them guaranteed, and often heavily discounted, access to a competitive, highly prized product. Most of the agreements for the advance sale of wool were made between Italian merchants and monastic orders in England. By effectively lending the monasteries money, the Italian merchants made vast profits from 2 sources. One, from the sale of the finished cloth, or selling the wool to other Italian cloth manufacturers, but also by charging high interest on the loans made against the wool, typically between 10 and 40%. A handful of Italian families dominated the highly lucrative dual businesses of wool trading and banking. The most famous of all, the Medici family, controlled political, social and cultural life in Florence for the best part of 300 years, from the 14th to the 17th century. The Medici, with their head for business and appetite for shrewd alliances, went from small-scale wool producers to global bankers and a political dynasty in just a few generations. Wealth bought power, but it also paid for the patronage of some of the greatest artists and thinkers of the Renaissance. Without the wool-trading, money-lending Medici family, we may have never had some of the greatest artistic, scientific and architectural achievements of all time. The House of Medici supported, among many others, Brunelleschi, Donatello, Fra Angelico, Botticelli, Leonardo da Vinci, Machiavelli, Michelangelo and Galileo, bankrolled the invention of the piano, and funded the development of opera as an art form. As well as marrying into various European royal families, the Medicis also produced 4 popes. One in particular was the hardliner Pope Clement VII, 1523-34, whose claim to fame was his excommunication of Henry VIII of England from the Catholic Church for annulling his marriage to Catherine of Aragon and marrying Anne Boleyn. Back in the monasteries, the heady combination of wool farming and big bank loans didn't always go to plan. Easy credit almost always comes with a crash. Even in good times, historical documents suggest that about 1 in 10 advance contracts fell through when monasteries couldn't deliver on their promises. During spells of widespread sheep disease, the numbers of disappointed buyers must have been considerably higher. The debt records for Rievaulx Abbey in Yorkshire, for example, reveal a spectacular fall from grace. Throughout the 1280s, the abbey had been playing 2 wealthy Italian merchants off each other, promising advance wool clips to both parties for huge sums of money. The abbey had large running costs and an ambitious building programme to fund, so mortgaging their future wool crop seemed a smart move. Instead, the sheep flock was devastated by scab, leaving Rievaulx with a growing mountain of debt. By 1291, with costs spiralling, the abbot was humiliatingly forced to disperse the congregation, close its doors to guests and travellers, and send his monks off to different Cistercian houses in the area until the abbey's cash flow improved. By the 14th century, most English-grown fleeces were being shipped abroad to two destinations in particular: the Low Countries and Florence, both of which were centres of excellence when it came to fine cloth. But because there just wasn't enough local wool to meet demand, and the homegrown fleeces available were far too coarse to weave into their incomparable cloth, both places were forced to import wool in huge quantities. England's wool exporting was greatly facilitated by its French territorial possessions, the region of Gascony in the southwest, and crucially, the Channel port of Calais in the northeast. Some imports of fine wool came from Burgundy and Spain. The Berbers from North Africa had introduced the merino breed with its white curly fleece to southern Spain in the 1100s. But it was Britain, with its predecessors of modern fine wool breeds such as the Cotswold and the Lincoln, who stole the lead. For once, Britain's rainy climate had given her the edge, the wet weather ensuring a longer grazing season and plenty of lush grass for wool sheep to thrive. England's hold over the wool market was well known, even at the time. One 13th century poet from Artois used the phrase "carrying wool to England" in the same way we would now say "carry coals to Newcastle." If export supplies were interrupted, foreign weavers soon suffered. In 1297, when such a stoppage took place, the land of Flanders, claimed the English chronicler Hemingrbrough, was well nigh empty, because the people cannot have the wools of England. Only 40 years later, in 1337, when Edward III temporarily stopped all exports of wool to much of Europe, the Low Countries were again quickly brought to their knees. The prosperity of the nation depended so heavily on wool that the barons of England sitting in Parliament asserted that wool represented half of England's wealth. Edward III knew this only too well. When he needed money to underwrite his military ambitions against France, it was the wool industry he turned to. His objectives were twofold. Firstly, to raise as much cash as he could by taxing the most profitable trade in England, and second, to use wool exports as a weapon to persuade his allies to join him. By threatening to stop English wool from entering those foreign regions who relied on it, such as Flanders, Edward III could bully his diplomatic friends into allegiance. In 1 year alone, English wool merchants loaned Edward III over £250 million in today's money and pledged to pay him half the profit on 30,000 sacks of wool. In return, only those merchants who agreed to the deal would be allowed to export wool abroad. Indeed, so obsessed was Edward III with the wool trade that he ordered his Lord Chancellor to sit on a bale of wool during council to symbolise the importance of wool to the English economy. The woolsack is the name now given to the wool-stuffed seat occupied by the Lord Speaker in the House of Lords, a huge square cushion covered in crimson cloth. In 1938, when the woolsack came to be reupholstered, it was discovered, rather embarrassingly, that over the centuries its wool contents had been bolstered with cheaper, coarser horsehair. Needless to say, it was hastily restuffed with wool from around Britain and the Commonwealth as a symbol of unity. And while the original woolsack is well known as a parliamentary symbol, there is actually another one. Just behind the woolsack is the judge's woolsack, an even larger cushion occupied by senior judges during state openings and by members of the Lords during normal sittings of the House, and a throwback to the days when legal advisers played a key role in medieval parliaments. Between the 13th and 15th centuries, wool made certain members of medieval English society very rich. As Joseph Hall, Bishop of Norwich, declared in the 17th century, "There were wont to be reckoned 3 wonders of England, Ecclesia, Fumina, Lana, churches, women, and wool." Ports such as London, Southampton, Boston, and Hull expanded to cope with the ever-increasing volume of wool exports. Duties were collected at each major port by specially appointed taxmen called collectors, who would then pass on the money to customers, who ensured that it made its way safely back to the City of London and into the pockets of the Exchequer. Searchers were also employed at the ports to make sure all the correct duties had been paid, and to arrest anyone dealing in counterfeit cash. Wool merchants were asked to present themselves at specially arranged custom houses. There, a huge set of scales weighed the packages of wool destined for abroad, and the duty was calculated on the spot. During the busiest times, almost 98% of customs revenue came from wool exports alone. And although the first written evidence for levying customs duties dates back to the age of King Athelbald of Mercia in the 8th century, we have sheep to thank for establishing Her Majesty's customs on a basis still recognisable today. Not everyone was willing to pay export taxes, however. Owling, so called because it was usually carried out at night and smugglers would hoot signals to each other, was the crime of smuggling sheep or wool out of the country. The punishments for those who were caught owling, which were enshrined in law by Edward III, were particularly brutal. Statutes from the time of Elizabeth I demand that anyone apprehended shall suffer imprisonment by the space of 1 whole year, and at the year's end shall in some open market town in the fulness of the market on the market day have his left hand cut off, and that to be nailed up in the openest place of such market. Other later amendments to the law included the added humiliations of confiscation of goods, 3 years' imprisonment for the master and all the mariners of the offending vessel, and transportation to the colonies for 7 years. During the 17th century, owling was rife, especially on the vast open stretches of Romney Marsh in south-east England. On a clear day, smugglers could see France from the shoreline of Kent and East Sussex. Many of them were also local fishermen who knew the coastal caves and creeks of the Channel well, making it possible for them to load ships in secret and sail under cover of darkness. In 1689, a bill was passed that outlawed all trade with France in the hope of protecting Britain's woolen textile industry. But it only served to redouble Owler's efforts. In the same year, £480,000, 218,000 kilograms of wool was smuggled to France. Far from being a romantic Robin Hood-esque enterprise, smuggling on England's south coast had become an organised criminal activity, catering to a wide and greedy market. From the last gasps of the 1600s to the first breaths of the 1800s, smuggling was a pitiless business, often violent, ruthless and bloody in the extreme, even when judged by the brutal standards of the time. Almost everyone, it seems, was in on it. Criminal gangs were often financed by local gentry, protected by bent magistrates, and hidden by local villagers and townsfolk. Even revenue officers weren't above taking bribes. Only the occasional brave soul felt able to take matters into their own hands. In 1714, Hugh Harsnet, a customs official, and Daniel Gates, a mariner, took it upon themselves to prosecute an owler, one Thomas Tanner, for illegally exporting wool. Amazingly, they won, and bagged a 40-shilling reward in the process, the equivalent of about 22 days' wages for a skilled tradesman. For Harsnet and Gates, the reward would have been a welcome windfall, but it was small fry compared to the staggering amounts of money made by the savviest wool merchants during the height of the wool trade. One of the earliest and most successful entrepreneurs was Lawrence of Ludlow, a rich tradesman for whom wool bought property, influence, and the ear of the king. From the 1270s, Lawrence was an enthusiastic wool trader, a business he inherited from his late father. He dealt in fleeces from local monasteries, farmers and landed gentry around Shropshire and the Welsh Marches, and when he wasn't working at one of his offices in either Shrewsbury or London, Lawrence would go on business trips abroad. To the great trade fairs of Champagne, for instance, to strike lucrative wool deals. With his money, Lawrence bought the manor of Stokesay and began building his dream home, Stokesay Castle, now one of the best preserved medieval manor houses in England. Wealth also bought him influence in court. When Edward I threatened to seize the entire country's wool supply, Lawrence persuaded him to raise funds by hiking up the custom rate on wool exports instead. Lawrence also became the king's paymaster, delivering both wool and money to his allies overseas. On one of these trips, however, disaster struck. In November 1294, Lawrence's fleet left for Flanders. After only a few days at sea, the ships ran into a storm and Lawrence's vessel was wrecked off the Suffolk coast. News of Lawrence's death travelled fast. Wool producers, who had been hit hard by Edward I's draconian tax, could barely conceal their delight. As one chronicler, the annalist of Dunstable Abbey, wrote, "Because Lawrence sinned against the wool growers, he was swallowed by the waves in a ship full of wool." Medieval businessmen clearly weren't a sentimental lot. Only days after his drowning, some of Lawrence's wool was recovered from the sea, dried off, and resold for a tidy profit. Not every wool merchant met a sticky end, of course. Many of the farmers, middlemen and landowners, made rich by the medieval wool trade, went on to build some of the country's finest houses, guild halls and public buildings. And some of England's prettiest, most chocolate-box towns and villages, places such as Hadley, Lavenham, Long Melford, Bury St Edmunds and Clare in Suffolk, and Chipping Campden, Burford, Stow-on-the-Wold, and Bybury in Gloucestershire, owe their embarrassment of architectural riches to the wool trade. Lavish spending wasn't just confined to domestic buildings. Families who had grown wealthy on wool made vast contributions to the construction or enlargement of their local parish churches, often creating places of worship that were completely out of scale with the tiny village congregation. Their motives were mixed: a heady cocktail of genuine piety, the desire to show off, and bleak cynicism encouraged wealthy donors. Visible acts of charity, or indulgences, were the quickest, if not the cheapest, way for a well-to-do merchant and his family to smooth their path to heaven. The Cathedral of the Cotswolds, St Peter and St Paul in North Leach, for example, is a formidable memorial to the local wool merchants whose lives were transformed by wool. The church was not only rebuilt and refurbished with wool money in the mid-15th century, when North Leach was the most prosperous and important wool town in the Cotswolds, but also contains many medieval brasses, memorial plaques to local benefactors. Most of the merchants shown on the plaques have their feet resting on or near sheep and wool packs to show the origins of their fortune. There are fascinating clues to the wool trade hidden within the brasses. On one, a woman has her foot on a sheep and wool pack, suggesting she was a trader in her own right. On another, John Forty, the single biggest donor to the church, is shown richly dressed in a fur-lined gown and a pendant that bears his wool mark, the signature stamp of each trader. Clearly keen to win favour with the Almighty, Forty's will not only donated a huge sum of money to finish the church renovations, but also bequeathed cash to every single prisoner in Gloucester Castle, £200 to make cloth for the poor, a bursary to support a student at Oxford for 4 years, £1 each to 80 poor women on their marriage, and half a mark, around 6 shillings and 10 pence in the currency of the day, each towards the upkeep of 120 other local churches. Regardless of the rationales behind the architectural bequests, few can argue with the results. England's wool churches are some of the most celebrated examples of medieval craftsmanship and architecture. In addition to St Peter and St Paul in North Leach, among the finest examples include St John the Baptist in both Cirencester and Burford, St James's in Chipping Campden and St Mary's in Chipping Norton, in Norfolk, St Agnes in Corston, St Peter's in Walpole, St Peter and St Paul's in Sal, and in Suffolk, St Edmunds at Southwold, Holy Trinity at Long Melford, and St Peter and St Paul at Lavenham, to name but a handful. There are literally hundreds of them. The county of Norfolk, for example, has 635 alone. The construction and interior design of the wool churches supported the livelihoods of hundreds of craftspeople, many of whom travelled from across Europe to work on the buildings. Legions of stonemasons and sculptors, stained glass makers, embroiderers, carpenters, painters, gilders and metalworkers were kept in employment thanks to the profits made from the wool trade. Far from immigration being a recent phenomenon, there are more than 1,000 records of foreign workers living in medieval Suffolk alone. One record from 1483, for example, shows 2 Flemish craftsmen, painter Anthony Lamerson and sculptor Henry Philip, living in Long Melford, working under the patronage of Sir John Clopton, a wealthy wool merchant who was financing the demolition and rebuilding of Holy Trinity Church. Only a few years earlier, Sir John had been arrested along with 5 others: John de Vere, Earl of Oxford, his son Aubrey de Vere, Sir Thomas Tuddenham, Sir William Tyrrell, and Sir John Montgomery. All 5 were sent to the Tower of London by Edward IV for writing to the wife of the former King Henry VI, an act of treason after the Yorkist Edward had deposed the Lancastrian Henry. While all the rest were beheaded, Sir John's neck was spared. Quite why Sir John was allowed to live when the others were executed isn't clear, but it is likely that wool money talked. Clopton was also a huge benefactor to the local parish, an executor for many other wealthy men's financial affairs, and the sheriff of both Norfolk and Suffolk. In medieval England, it seems, wool could buy not only a place in the afterlife, but some security in this one, or in the words of an inscription at the home of a wool merchant from Newark, "I thank God and ever shall, it is the sheep that paid for all."